Hi, welcome to Psychic Manifesto. I'm your host, Ian Peckrell. Join us as we explore consciousness through the work of Jane Roberts and a body of information known as the Seth material. Today, I would like to introduce my next guest on Psychic Manifesto, Virginia Bennett. Virginia, welcome to Psychic Manifesto.
Really delighted to be here, Ian.
Virginia Bennett, a PhD, is a professor of psychology and a clinical psychologist in private practice in Berkeley, California, specializing in the use of hypnosis. She also has a doctorate in parapsychology and has spent her life seeking a fusion between mainstream psychology and metaphysical explorations, including past life regressions, lucid dreaming, altered states, and the integration of psychedelic and anomalous experiences. Since the 1970s, she has read and actively participated with the Seth material, presenting for many years at Seth conferences and the International Association for the Study of Dreams. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to do the interview. I am a huge fan of you presented last year at the California Seth conference about your presentation. I believe it was titled Seth on Psychedelics or Seth about Psychedelics.
Yes, you could take that different ways. That's correct. Yeah.
Hey, would
yeah.
you mind, one of the things you covered in your presentation at the last year's conference was, what does the word psychedelic mean?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good place to start. So the word psychedelic, if you get back to the Latin meanings, we have psyche, meaning psyche, soul, and delic meaning to reveal or to bring forth or to manifest. So we could say psychedelics are referring to experiences in which the soul is revealed or manifested or we get in contact with it. Now these days there's another term that's come into usage which is entheogen, and an entheogen means specifically then a substance that brings forth the divine within or allows us to contact the divine. And we don't have to get too hung up on those two words, but it's useful sometimes to make a differentiation because people can have so-called psychedelic experience or use psychedelic drugs where you're going to get a lot of visual effects and distortions and hallucinations, but they may not necessarily gear one towards connecting to the inner self or these other levels that you could consider to be divine or sacred. And likewise, there are substances in which you will not have a psychedelic effect, but they connect you more, quote, to the divine within, such as MDMA. So that's kind of a finer edge to get into this, and we can stay with the term psychedelics, but I think sometimes it's useful to be familiar with both of those terms. What we're talking about, though, certainly today, and in terms of the Seth material, is whatever experiences help us to contact the inner self, greater levels of consciousness, and to let that be a direct experience in our lives.
Could you talk a little bit about, the Seth material, Seth's real first attempt to contact Jane Roberts was when she wrote, I don't know if she was in trance, she just said she was working on, writing one day, and she came out with the paper entitled The Universe's Idea Construction.
Right.
One of the things that impressed me the most about Jane Roberts was she had these incredibly powerful, life-changing psychedelic experiences without the use of drugs. Could you talk a little bit, you covered that so eloquently in some of your past presentations. Could you talk a little bit about what happened that day in 1963 when she came up with that idea construction paper?
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned the date. So this is the early 1960s. Jane's sitting at her kitchen table. She's probably about to write a poem or do something. She was probably running some pretty high levels of caffeine. She liked her coffee a little early in the day for the beer or wine, which would be the evening activities. But so she's about to write this thing, and then she says she had this experience of being propelled out of her body and kind of flying out the window, and her consciousness opening up, where she was a part of everything, every leaf, every tree, every blade of grass. She was exquisitely aware of a little nail on the door, on the windowsill. And so she has this mind-blowing psychedelic experience, no drugs, as you said, other than a little caffeine. And then she comes back and she looks down and she has written 100 pages. So I don't know how long she was out. And the title of it was The Universe as Idea Construction. So we have right there, as you said, Seth coming through. She's tuning in to this material that's coming through her with her cooperation, really. And that's the inception of the Seth material. And then it was some months later when she was talking to her husband, Rob, saying she wanted to come up with a book idea. And he said, oh, well, honey, why don't you do something about developing ESP? And she's saying, I don't know anything about ESP. And he's saying, well, that would be the point. You would explore it. And you had that weird thing that happened a few months ago. Do you think maybe that has something to do with ESP? And she's like, I don't know, maybe. So they got out the Ouija board and Seth came through, and the rest is history, however many volumes of the Seth material we have. But I think you're absolutely right that Jane was very skilled, and she had to learn too. Seth talks about working with her to go in and out of these trance states and to allow her consciousness to move into a place where Seth could connect and then come through and dictate and verbalize the concepts that he was trying to bring forward. And also with the help of her husband, then transcribing and asking questions and things like that. So it was really the three of them that brought together a synthesis that's given us the Seth material.
Now, like you said, Jane started channeling Seth in '63. I don't, idea construction started in '63. I know The Nature of Personal Reality was written in 1972, where Seth really had a lot to say about LSD and, what was the difference between, say, the way Native Americans use peyote as opposed to the way we use more modern, synthesized psychedelics like LSD. What was Seth's take on people using psychedelic drugs? Did he encourage it? Did he say it's not a good idea? What was his take?
Yeah, I'd like to quote him in saying, this is at the start of Individual Massive Events. He says, we have never told anybody to do anything except to face up to the abilities of consciousness. So I think that's just a nice way to frame it. And then he also said at one point, I am not denying that the drug experience can be excellent, however. So this is the range that he was operating in. And when we go to the early sessions, which occurred before he was dictating Nature of Personal Reality, he actually has a lot more specific information about psychedelics than what showed up in the Nature of Personal Reality, although that is important also. So Jane had been reading, at that time, there were articles coming out about psychedelics, the use of psychedelics in therapy. They were legal at that point. It wasn't until 1972 that LSD was made illegal. So she was reading articles about that, and Seth came in and he had a lot to say about the use of psychedelics and cautioning people about it, but at the same time recognizing that it was a tool. For example, he referred, which I found interesting, to Timothy Leary's work, who was a psychologist, and would talk about the imprinting, that we get this egoic, talk about red pill, blue pill, we get this conditioned grid system that actually regulates our perceptual system so we can operate in physical reality. But as Seth pointed out, and he said Seth said, it's fashionable to term this the ego. That's our current language for it. But as Seth has pointed out, it could get, and has gotten kind of too dominant in our culture. It gets too rigid. And Leary had pointed out that psychedelics have a way of kind of lifting this imprinting and having, so we can experience something else. And Seth agreed with him. He said, yes, they can lift that imprinting. We can have a different experience, a greater experience of ourselves that can be very helpful, especially for the egos that are too concentrated, they're too rigid. So it can do that. But now this is where we can jump ahead to Nature of Personal Reality, where someone showed up at Jane's place in his ESP classes, and this young man who had been kind of doing his own soul searching, had worked with a psychiatrist who did LSD therapy with him over several sessions, and the young man kept getting more anxious. And as was kind of the concept of the time, which actually goes back to Freud, that we have this defense structure that keeps our real self or our authentic feelings repressed. And if we can just lift off those defenses, then the real self, real feelings can come through, perhaps in a very cathartic way. And that will be freeing. So I'm sure under those auspices, a psychiatrist was saying, oh, well, we need to increase the dose and we'll break through your defense system and then you'll be free and liberated from your fears. Only the problem is they did that, a massive dose of LSD. We don't know exactly what that was. And the young man, the good news is he came back, but he was really shaken. He was really shaken up by this. And he wanted to talk to Seth about it. And that's where Seth, so this is in chapter 10 of Nature of Personal Reality, that he's saying massive doses, he asks Rob to underline that, massive doses of LSD, especially when the intention, which is with LSD therapy, it also often was the intention to basically kill the ego, thinking, well, now we're going to free the self. So isn't that a good idea? And Seth said, no, actually, that is not a very good idea, because not that you can't do it. Oh, yeah, you can do it. You can kill the ego, but you're going to have to get another one, because the ego is what helps us to navigate physical reality. I mean, even Freud said that the ego is the mediator between internal and external experience. So you got to have some lens, something to allow one to navigate and stay focused on physical reality. And that's why you need an ego. But if you've already killed an ego, now you develop a new one, only that one knows what happened to the last one. That's why I've used that analogy. Good news is you're the new Queen of England. The bad news is you know what happened to the other one.
Yeah, she had her head lopped off. Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah.
So the new ego is going to be much shakier. And,
yeah.
and Seth was like, we don't want to go there. That if you can bring, and that this is where, by the way, it's volume 7 of early sessions. If folks want to have a look at this, kind of in the 200-page range.
Well, and Seth also used the term ego death, I believe, right? Like
yes.
If you use through massive doses of LSD, what happened was actually ego death. And then the idea was that, you know, there would be the sense of rebirth, and this new ego would come up, and it would be sitting on the same bed of problems that the old ego was. But I mean, just I don't want to interrupt your great flow here, but yeah,
no, I'm glad.
I think he did use the term ego death, and yeah, but like you're describing it very eloquently. Yeah.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think there's a finer point to this. All right. Which is that, and this is not only through drugs, okay? People can have experience, but let's keep it in the drug range, since that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So people can have, under the influence of drugs, they can go into a state of ego dissolution, okay? The ego dissolves. Now, for one thing, I'm going to make a distinction between that happening more spontaneously versus some form of therapy or an intention to get rid of the ego, or the ego is bad. I would say there's a difference between that. And Seth says, and actually here's a quote, with LSD and similar drugs, they lift the imprinting, and then he says that they can lead personalities into a, quote, mystical experience. Okay, when the imprinting is lifted, the ego is dissolved, we can have this mystical experience. They carry the personality into new realms of perception. You'll see with new inner eyes. And he says this is freedom for the inner self. So there can be a release in a mystical experience of becoming one with all that is. Incredibly powerful experience, and an experience that people also have without drugs. So it's important to know, right, mystical experiences happen. However, as Seth points out, and as you just pointed out, you come back, okay? It's not just becoming one with all. We also have individuated and individualized consciousness. So we're going to come back, and you still got to pay the rent, and you still got to take care of the kids. And so now what do you do with this? Like Jack Kornfield, the Buddhist, says, after enlightenment, the laundry. Right?
Yeah.
So, it doesn't get you out of that. And
right.
Seth says also, that mystical experience in and of itself isn't going to necessarily help you to explore other realms. It's not going to necessarily help you explore past lives, future lives, other dimensions, out-of-body experiences. So that's great to become one with all that is. And again, it can be a relief to even know that that exists. But that's where we just roll up our sleeves because the work has just begun. And now it's how do we begin to navigate and learn how to explore some of these other realms, hopefully not necessarily having to use the drugs, right? It's Baba Ram Dass, once you get the message, hang up the phone. Yeah. Although Seth does say that it's true, once you have these experiences, you may have a way of tuning into them that can be more easily accessed. Not recommending psychedelics per se, but recognizing, and this is true, once you have had an experience, any kind of experience, it's going to be easier to find it later.
I like that quote. I thought that was actually Alan Watts that made that comment, like once you get the message with psychedelics, hang up the phone. For me, what psychedelics did was demonstrate proof of concept, proof that there is an unknown reality, that we are, there is, for me it validated the idea of a multidimensional being. Right. I'm always impressed when people can do that without drugs, and for me, absolutely, it's the idea of being able to replicate those experiences now without the use of drugs. Right. Could you talk a little bit about, Seth, the nature of personal reality? Seth had a lot to say about LSD, and I want to read a quote, and I'd like to, which I'm sure you're already familiar with, but it's really Seth talking about the difference between the way Native Americans use peyote. So I'll just read the quote. This is from chapter 10 of The Nature of Personal Reality. This is Seth. Within their native framework, some American Indians use peyote in their own way, but not as gluttons, stunning and annihilating their systems. They accept it as a natural ingredient belonging to their earthly structure. They do not try to blast themselves out of existence. They use it to increase the innate perceptions that they have.
Right. I think what he's saying there too, this is where, to my mind, people can get a little hung up thinking, because Seth also said, there's marijuana, but it's a natural herb, and he was really distinguishing it from LSD. And I think people can get a little hung up on, well, is it plant medicine and that makes it natural, and so that's more okay than if it's a synthesized chemical. And I think that really misses the point that you're quoting, which is with peyote, this is a part of a people's culture. I mean, this is a sacred ceremonial substance that is approached in that way. And so the people of those tribes that used it already had a framework and an understanding of the substance and even of all that is, that they're coming from a really different place and they're using it in a really different way. And I mean, that's where there's quite a difference between doing that and then doing something as a kind of party drug or to see just how obliterated someone can become. I think the good news in the resurgence of psychedelics is I do see a lot more respect for setting, for the sacred quality, with all of the experiences people are having with ayahuasca, for example, and the ceremonial and sacred aspects of that. Some of that then is coming into Western culture in a way that can, I think, really help people have more positive experiences with it. It's kind of interesting because at the same time it's coming in through pharmaceutical companies as this is getting legalized, and is this just a drug that we can give somebody and then they're not depressed anymore? Well, with therapy, yes, without, maybe. So actually it's been kind of interesting to watch this process happen of what does Western mentality, especially materialistic mentality, do with substances that truly are psychedelic. They are soul revealing. So what are we doing in this culture with these things? And I think that quote really speaks to approaching these things with great respect and intention. And I think it's also important to recognize one's belief systems, because there can be a naivete in saying, well, I'll just go down to the Amazon jungle and this person says he's a shaman, and so I'll partake of this and it's all going to be kind of okay. Well, maybe, and maybe it really will. But on the other hand, you're bringing your beliefs with you. And this may be a culture you know nothing about, or they may know nothing about you. So you want to make sure you know what you're doing. And I think there is a kind of, let's say, an excessive eagerness sometimes on the part of Westerners to just embrace an indigenous culture that they know nothing about. So
Didn't
kind of know where you are.
Didn't Seth say, you were talking about, Seth mentioned a doctor. I'm going to pull up, because I'm fascinated by the nature of personal reality. That book has changed my life.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pull up, this is another quote from chapter 10. He had been working with the drugs, psychedelics, I believe LSD, in a therapeutic framework for some time. Before this, he had wandered through India following a guru. He left the guru to follow the doctor. Was this Dr. Timothy Leary?
No.
Okay.
I doubt that very much.
This is a quote from
I don't know
NLPR
that.
chapter 10.
No, I have to say,
Yeah.
I don't know that, but I doubt that. But I do know that there were Stan Grof was doing LSD therapy in the 1960s. And so were a lot of other therapists. It wasn't all that common, but they were exploring the use of LSD, for example, to help with alcoholism. People were doing genuine therapeutic work and research at that time, but they were also coming from this model, I think, in many cases. There was a particular person that was doing this in groups and would do a kind of onslaught with people with high doses of a variety of different drugs, not just LSD. And so that was something that was being practiced. And it sounds like this young man got connected with someone like that.
This is, one of the only things, this is one of the things I've seen kicked up or cause a lot of disputes on some of the Seth Facebook groups around, when we talk about psychedelics and Seth's take on it. Every time he mentioned psychedelics or there was a caution against using LSD, it was always massive doses. He cautioned people against using massive doses, and it's a totally different experience. He said, and we talked about ego death a little bit. So in therapy, using massive doses, this is Seth again from The Nature of Personal Reality, chapter 10. In therapy, using massive doses of LSD, a condition of chemically enforced insanity takes place. By insanity, I mean a situation in which the conscious mind is forced into a state of powerlessness. There was a literal assault made not only upon the psyche, but upon the organizational framework that makes it possible for you to exist rationally in the world that you know. The ego, of course, cannot be annihilated in physical life. Kill one, and another must emerge from the inner self, which is its source. So we were talking about ego death before in a psychic slaying. What's the difference between what you were talking about, like Seth was talking about how, or Timothy Leary was talking about how our framework or our rigid like the ego has this stranglehold on the rest of our psyche. And according to Seth, the ego is not the redheaded stepchild of the psyche that needs to be destroyed. It just needs to stop being a bully and start allowing in information from the unconscious self. So what's the difference between this chemically enforced position of insanity and, what Timothy Leary's talking about, where, we're just kind of changing our structure? I know I probably didn't articulate that question terribly well.
No, it's perfect, and it's a good point to start to round things up here. Is first of all, the main difference is dosage. Frankly, it's how much you're taking and what you're taking, and that's obviously not the only variable, but there's a big one. But the whole point is whether you're doing psychedelic. See, this is one reason why Seth and myself included, natural methods are better because the ego is there. You use hypnosis, you use trance, you use psi time, even dreams. Our ego is kind of there along for the ride. And this is when people microdose now. Well, if you microdose LSD or psilocybin or mushrooms or something, your ego is definitely along for the ride. It's still driving the car, literally, right? So this idea of and Seth says a lot about this in volume 7, that if you let the ego come along for the ride, but the ego learns to kind of sit in the corner. I have to do this with hypnosis, help people understand your ego doesn't go anywhere. You don't lose consciousness, but you get that part of your mind to kind of sit in the corner, and it can take notes. That's great. But now you allow your inner mind, your inner self to come forward. And that's where the action is. That's where it gets fun. And if you allow that, so it's a kind of yoga for the ego, the ego to get more flexible, right? And when you reassure the ego, I'm not trying to kill you. I love you. You help me make sure that I find my home and it's time for dinner, right? This is wonderful. But just because we have a car doesn't mean we have to live our life in the car. There are times to park the car, get out of the car, and then you can come back to it. So, and that's where Seth says, if you bring the ego along for the ride, then it can be translating and interpreting and taking these experiences, not getting them in the way of them. But then when you come back to your ordinary waking level of consciousness, whether that's kind of out of a trance or side time, you come back and then you're able to kind of start to integrate and make sense of that versus a chemically driven method that's going to, and it has effects in the brain. I mean, they can see this with brain mapping. It will offline your executive functioning. So the ego cannot function. It basically is imprisoned. And now all these other things are happening and you're not ready for it. And it's very hard to integrate it. And that sets up a bad relationship with the self, right? I mean, we have many different aspects. We don't want to imprison one part because that's going to make another part free. We got to work together. So I think that's really the point. And what better way to do it than to do it naturally? And then, okay, fine, if you're going to do psychedelics, but be careful, lower doses rather than higher doses. Be aware of what you're doing.
Yeah, and that was something both Seth and Jane Roberts constantly stressed, that, the conscious mind already has all the answers that we need. We don't need, with all due respect to you as a psychologist, psychologists, psychedelics, therapists, shamans, mystics, psychics can all be helps, but the ideas, we already have the ideas in our conscious mind. Virginia, thank you for so much. Thank you so much for being a guest on Psychic Manifesto. Virginia is going to come back, and this is going to be a two-parter, so she will be also the next guest. Okay. So thank you to all our viewers for tuning in. I'd like to remind you Psychic Manifesto is now a Facebook group and a YouTube channel. And special thanks to TV Santa Barbara for helping produce this. And Virginia, thank you for being on my Psychic Manifesto. All right.
Thank you so much, Ian.
All right, see you next time. The experiment continues. All right.
Whisper in the darkness as the December sun goes down. Breeze blowing around your feet as you stumble from the ground. The secrets in the moving dust. Know why your heart still beats. The stairs leading from the house